Like the Movement Media Alliance, the Park Center and the Izzy Awards are examples of bringing together independent media to build power. And that's one of the reasons, the many reasons, we are honored to be presenting this Izzy Award to the San Francisco Public Press for their incredible investigative series, Exposed, the Human Radiation Experiments at Hunter Point. This phenomenal 8-part series is a perfect example of why social justice-driven journalism is so essential. Through muckraking research, the reporting team reveals how the US Navy carried out harmful radiation experiments on thousands of people without their consent at the San Francisco Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory.
I was lucky enough to talk to Michael earlier today during lunch, and Rebecca as well. Michael talked about how this reporting came to be after 24 years of carrying around milk crates of records and 7 years of reporting work. Hearing how this came together really proves how crucial independent media outlets are to the communities that need them, not just as a public record, but as a tool for accountability. A huge congratulations to Rebecca, Chris, Michael, and the phenomenal editorial team at the San Francisco Public Press.
Congrats!
Hi, everyone. This is going to be a team effort. I'm going to go first. My name is Chris. I would like to start with some gratitude. When you offer gratitude, you're acknowledging a debt. I owe too much to too many people to mention, but here are some highlights. On behalf of my colleagues and my fellow honorees, I want to extend my thanks to the Park Center and the judges and everyone here in this room for recognizing our work and for everything else they do to amplify independent voices. I believe it's what the founders of the Republic wanted. I owe Mickey Huff and his predecessors and colleagues on Project Censored in particular. I discovered Project Censored towards the end of college. My head already spinning with Howard Zinn, Naomi Klein's No Logo, Hunter Thompson, who, if you can believe it, was first taught to me by one of my Jesuit professors, and of course, Izzy Stone's earned wisdom that all governments lie. For someone who came of age during the global war on terror, it helped. It helped me find solidarity and kindred spirits and granted me some reassurance that I wasn't crazy, that what I saw happening was in fact happening, despite the constant drumbeat from voices I was taught to trust, insisting otherwise. It's fulfilling and humbling to think that something I worked on might be considered in the same light, and maybe motivate someone else to follow the same path. If that's you, whoever you are, my apologies in advance, but we need more people like you, and now more than ever. Thanks also to my family, to Shahrazad, my better half, who let me borrow the car and take long phone calls at inopportune times and listen to my internal feedback more than it was reasonable, to my parents who instilled in me the values and critical skills that allowed me to recognize an outrage for what it is. I told my father, in particular, a lot about this project, and I know that he wanted to see it. And finally, I want to acknowledge Sharon Hewitt, a San Francisco legend known to me and many others as G-Ma, who always fearlessly stood up for her people so righteously and lovingly and patiently, and who took the extra time to bridge the enormous divide that systemic racism cleaved between someone like them and her and someone like me. And as for what we did, I think it was fall of 2017 when Michael told me that he had something interesting in a box in his attic. He had some old papers from the Atomic Research Lab that the US Navy ran at the shipyard in town. First, let me try and set some of the context. Years before, I had been spellbound by a series in SF Weekly, an alt weekly where I'd later work, by Lisa Davis, who documented the massive amounts of radioactive material that the Navy used at the shipyard and at its lab. They had weapons-grade plutonium, they had uranium, you name it, and it was all there within city limits. And that shipyard, by the way, had been for generations the biggest real estate story in San Francisco. It's also located in the city's most disadvantaged neighborhood, a place that shocked James Baldwin when he saw it in the early 1960s, and a place that shocked me when I started reporting on it in the late aughts. But the shipyard was something else. It was a fenced-off, toxic, no-go zone within a no-go zone. How did it get like that? What did it do to the neighborhood exactly? There were a lot of crazy stories and rumors, and there were and are a lot of sick people. But back to that box. What was in it were papers that Michael had fetched for himself from the archives after the SF Weekly story. And they had a smoking gun, he told me, proof that the Navy had done some secret radiation experiments down at the lab. I didn't tell him this then, but I was kind of skeptical. Well, they weren't very well-kept secrets if they were in a box in his attic, but I agreed to take a peek at them and deliver, within a few months, a couple thousand words. Becca had already done most of the podcast about the neighborhood's present. What I was going to offer was a kind of diversion, a little peek into the past. What else can you say other than there was more than one box? There were hundreds upon hundreds. His box led to more boxes, which led to more archives and even more boxes. And we know there are documents that we didn't get, either because various government agencies or archives insisted that they didn't have them, because in some cases they are still classified, or because Michael got sick of hearing about more boxes. I've become fond of saying that if we turned over every page like Robert Caro instructs, I'd probably still be in the archives. So I'm thankful that at some point we had to produce something. And what we did get was plenty disturbing. The U.S. Naval Radiological Defense Laboratory, in the height of the Cold War, exposed at least 1,073 people to radiation, with many of them given no choice in the matter. And since nobody knew for certain what even low levels of exposure do to the human body, no hope of giving informed consent. You need to know the risk for a study to be ethical. And of those, we know of at least a couple hundred people who got doses big enough to almost certainly cause them health problems later in life. Almost certainly because radiation exposure is a perfect crime. It's very hard to say for certain what causes this cancer or that autoimmune disease, and most of the victims are long gone. Most, but not all. That land is still contaminated today. There are many people in that neighborhood who believe that it may explain why they and their families are sick, sicker than others, with some of the worst health outcomes in the Bay Area. That's partially why I think the story is still relevant today. But it's also about an institution and the decisions it made decades ago. It reminds us that institutions are made up of people who make decisions, sometimes difficult ones, and sometimes careless or selfish or ignorant ones, the consequences of which are felt for generations. And here, in the Navy, was an institution that was careless, selfish, and reckless all at once. After World War II, the Navy was scared and thought it was on its way out. It wasn't relevant anymore, so it tried to get a piece of the atomic bomb. When it did, things got way out of hand. So it doubled down and brought a radioactive problem back to California, so it could take full advantage and extract something out of the problem, despite a clear human cost. The Navy got what spoiler alert, the Navy got what it wanted. To this day, it can deploy by itself more nuclear warheads than any country aside from Russia, China, France, and the UK. I don't know if San Francisco or America got much out of the bargain. I do have some tolerance for some of the individual scientists who ran some of these experiments that we documented. They were in a wartime scenario, facing an existential threat. I don't think that excuses what they did, but it does illustrate, as I.F. Stone said, what a devil's bargain and utter madness the nuclear enterprise was and has been from the very start. It also reveals the nuclear enterprise's sinister irony. Possessing these weapons has cost us, Americans, dearly. We have sickened ourselves. Because of this, there are now 450 acres of land in San Francisco that, if not unusable, are at least limited in potential for a human eternity. In this way, decisions made a lifetime ago make our world worse. The housing crisis is worse, income inequality is worse, systemic racism is worse. It is truly the worst of us, and we are stuck with it. And this happened all over the country and all over the world. It has followed us like a curse. And maybe it should. Rather than use this spectacular treasure the post-war era showered on the United States, or recoil with horror at what we did to civilians in Japan, we pursued a destructive force to rival nature's, at the cost of bankrupting cities and sentencing our people to austerity and misery. Such hubris. And here's where I get really dark and bleak. The thing is, our project failed. We didn't get the whole story. I can't tell you exactly what the lab did to San Francisco and the generations of people who live there. That is because we don't know. It hasn't been studied. We only got the Navy's era. That is an institutional failure. The Navy never investigated what the lab did to its people past its property line, nor is the Navy trying to answer the question of what the lab's legacy is doing to people now and who might live there in the future. I don't think it wants to know. The problem is not enough people are pressing the Navy to make it known, and that includes the city's elected representatives. Among them, some of the most powerful people in America, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, and if the governor of California has his way, the next president. I think they're not pressing the question because not enough voters are forcing them to ask it. This makes me wonder whether we did a good enough job. I'd like to think that it just means the job is undone. Maybe someone listening to this will finish it. Maybe they're not even born yet. Whoever it is and wherever you are, I'm in your corner and I'll be cheering you on. Thank you.
Good evening. First of all, I just want to express my deep gratitude and say how humbling it is to receive an Izzy Award. This project came from working many long hours on nights and weekends outside of my day job over the course of years. So it's just incredible to have these efforts recognized. I produced a 2-part podcast for the Exposed series, and what was most important to me as I approached this work was centering the voices of people living nearby the Hunters Point shipyard. The environmental justice advocates who I interviewed are part of a multi-generational effort to have the radioactive contamination at this site addressed properly and to protect community health. One resident told me that she and others engaged in this work often felt they weren't being taken seriously by federal and local officials. She said it often felt like they were being treated as if they couldn't understand the science or like they were overreacting. For example, I had long heard stories about an underground fire that nearby residents saw flare up at the shipyard one night, a blaze of many colors. I was told that the people who called the health department were simply advised not to worry about it. So as I approached this podcast, I wanted it to be one that would take residents' voices seriously rather than dismissing them. The first episode includes a clip of Marie Harrison sounding off at a 2017 community meeting. You can hear her saying, "Now you know what a lie sounds like. This is a lie." She was talking about the Navy. Marie was a prominent advocate affiliated with Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice. She passed away in 2019 from a chronic lung disease that her doctors suspected was precipitated by toxins. Today, Marie's daughter, Ariane Harrison, has taken up the cause of fighting for a complete remediation at the shipyard. But Ariane faces even greater complexity, as projections of sea level rise at the site mean that underground toxic elements could push their way to the surface in a flood event and create entirely new exposure pathways. Chris and I agreed that for our talk, he would cover the past, as in all the way back in the Cold War era, while I would focus on the present. Well, present is a subjective term. After all, the shipyard was designated as a federal Superfund site in 1989. The remediation project has been underway for close to 4 decades now. So we'll go back in time only by about 30 years. In the second episode of the podcast, you actually hear a clip of President Bill Clinton speaking at a press conference about the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. That committee was convened in 1994 to study revelations of experiments that intentionally exposed humans to radiation conducted by government scientists. And by the way, that advisory committee never would have formed if it hadn't been for the award-winning work of investigative reporter Eileen Wellsome, who we also interviewed for this podcast, who authored the book The Plutonium Files, America's Secret Medical Experiments in the Cold War. In 1994, President Clinton also took another action that relates to our story. He issued an executive order calling on federal agencies to address environmental justice. So this meant that the movement's core principle of guaranteeing equitable access to a healthy environment would start to begin to, inform federal policy. In 2021, President Biden established the White House Office of Environmental Justice, requiring federal agencies to develop policies to eliminate current and historic environmental disparities. Well, nobody in this room needs me to tell them how dramatically things have changed from January of 2021 to January of 2025. On his second day in the White House, President Trump revoked Clinton's 1994 Environmental Justice Executive Order. Since then, the Trump administration has terminated environmental justice divisions at the EPA, closing all regional offices focused on this work. EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin has canceled more than 400 environmental justice grants, totaling $1.7 billion, and deep staffing cuts at the EPA are underway now, all of which mean fewer staff scientists who study things like toxic exposure at Superfund sites. Environmental justice advocates like the ones I interviewed for this series are now operating in an environment where even the reference to environmental justice has been scrubbed from federal government websites. But that doesn't mean that advocacy efforts to protect people affected will slow down. At a protest in January of 2025 near the shipyard in San Francisco, environmental and social justice groups cited our reporting, and I could not feel more proud to have contributed to this ongoing fight for health and justice, and could not feel more proud to accept this award. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Stoll. I was the editor in the project. One of the most lucid lines in the investigative reporter's handbook is keep the outrage in sight. When immersing yourself in local accountability journalism, or any accountability journalism, never forget that it matters to human beings. This fill in the blank is killing people, and the world has to know about it, even if no one asked. The result may be an emotionally grueling process, even morbid at times, but it can produce invaluable work. What propelled our project was our team's shared outrage that the community could lose its collective memory of a time when, in the name of Cold War military readiness, some souls were expendable. That people entrusted with power could make such unethical decisions. But even with many of the victims long gone, their stories could help our democratic society avoid repeating the same mistakes. Large, well-endowed journalism institutions may seem to have advantages in carrying out elaborate team projects, but this may be an area where independent media has an edge, even if the results are less flashy and take longer to publish. In our case, the government documents I carried around for years was a project too big for any one journalist to tackle alone. This wild seed of a story needed sunlight, time, and the right soil to grow. So the San Francisco Public Press, which I co-founded in 2009, became a nursery to sprout it. I shared my findings with two freelance reporters who previously demonstrated their own sense of outrage at the environmental injustice at the shipyard. They knew better than I how to frame it, whom to interview next, and what questions to ask. With no one working full-time on it, it took several more years to finish and eventually required the contributions of more than 30 people, fact-checkers, photo archivists, designers, photographers, audio producers, editors, expert science and legal reviewers, and community outreach specialists. The result, a 34,000-word multimedia series, including an hour of podcasts and historical images and annotated records, tell the story more completely than ever before, showing that when documenting exploitation, there is no substitute for passion. We are honored to receive the Izzy Award, whose spirit reverberates in many small newsrooms that still speak truth to power 90 years after I.F. Stone first started warning America about the rise of fascism. Current events are a stark reminder that there will likely never be a time when the muckrakers can rest. Investigative reporting isn't a business. It's a knot in your stomach that won't let go. The feeling that someone must tell the truth and there's no one around who's going to do it for you. We didn't do this for the clicks or the clout. We did it because the story mattered, and that's what makes independent journalism indispensable. Thank you.
Thanks so much.